Wyatt Quinn dried the last of the dinner plates in the kitchen, humming along to the sound of the dishwasher. He moved with precision and method, taking the same approach to everything in life, from balancing corporate books to arranging the spice rack. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see his children sprawled on the living room floor, homework spread around them like fallen leaves. Landon, 11, was helping his younger sister Skye with her maths. His dark hair fell over his forehead as he leaned over her worksheet, pointing out, "See, first, you need to multiply these numbers, then divide by the total." He didn't understand it. Skye was twirling her blonde hair like her mother's around her finger. It would normally warm him to see her like that, but lately, everything felt off-kilter, like the numbers in an audit that didn't quite add up. Wyatt placed the last plate in the cabinet, aligning it perfectly with the others. He'd always been good at controlling what he could control. That was his mantra through 15 years of Foran's County. The front door opened, and Amber breezed in, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She was late again. The wall clock read 7:45 p.m. 2 hours after her last show was scheduled to end, Mummy Skye jumped up, forgetting her papers scattered across the floor. She gave her daughter a kiss on the head and glanced at Wyatt. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled, and her lipstick had been reapplied. Wyatt noticed these details, filing them away. He apologized for being late, explaining that the show had run longer than expected. He noted the slight flush in her cheeks, and the way she immediately went to her phone when it broke the Richardson. Wyatt noticed that she was already typing something with her manicured nails tapping against the screen. He thought, "Oh no, the lakefront condo, the one that sold last week." He didn't say anything, though, and just watched as she quickly ended whatever she was typing when he stepped closer. Her perfume was stronger than it had been that morning, layered with something else, a cologne that didn't belong to him. He called out, "Kids, it's time to get ready for bed," in his usual calm tone, despite the tension coiling in his chest. Landon started to protest, holding up his science textbook. "I still need to finish my chapter questions," he said. "No buts. School tomorrow. You can finish your homework in the morning. I'll help you before breakfast." As the children trudged upstairs, Amber's phone buzzed again. Wyatt caught a glimpse of the name before she turned away. It was Dean G., the contractor who'd been working with her on the property. He was the same one who'd been at every open house, every showing, every emergency client meeting. Over the past few months, there's never a moment's peace in real estate. "You know how it is?" he asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You know how it is in real estate, always on call." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her fingers drummed against her phone case, a nervous tic she'd developed recently. "I need to take this business call." Wyatt nodded, watching as she slipped into the kitchen. He moved silently to the doorway, staying just out of sight. Her voice drifted out softer than any business call should be. "I can't talk long," she whispered. He let out a low laugh that made his stomach turn. "No, he doesn't suspect anything. You know how he is, always buried in his spreadsheets." His hands were clenched at his sides, but his face remained impassive. Years of forensic accounting had taught him patience and to gather evidence before making accusations. He'd uncovered millions in corporate fraud with that same methodical approach. People always let traces in, numbers and patterns in the small inconsistencies they thought no one would notice. "I'll have to think of something else tomorrow." Another quiet laugh. "You're terrible. I'll text you later." When Amber came out of the kitchen, Wyatt was sitting at his laptop, looking like he was absorbed in work. She passed behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. The gesture felt a bit empty now. "Don't stay up too late with those numbers, honey." He could smell unfamiliar cologne on her black blouse. It was more clearly now masculine, expensive, not the kind of client who would wear it to a showing. He replied as he was finishing up. Wyatt opened a new spreadsheet, but instead of corporate figures, he began documenting times, dates, and inconsistencies. The late meetings, weekend showings, and networking events that seemed to multiply each week. He watched, listened, and documented each morning. Amber spent extra time getting ready, applying makeup with precision, and choosing outfits with care. Each evening she came home later, always with a ready excuse. The clients were indecisive, traffic was terrible, and she had to wait for the inspector. Emergency showing came up, detracted her mileage against property listings, noted the charges at restaurants miles from her supposed showings, cataloged the Larry purchases that he never saw, and every detail went into a spreadsheet. Every discrepancy was noted and cross-referenced. One evening, as he helped Landon with his science project, a model of the solar system, Amber swept through the living room. She'd changed clothes since morning. Her conservative business suit was replaced by a form-fitting. He'd never seen a dress like it before. She was going on an emergency showing, and grabbed her keys from the bowl by the door. "Don't wait up," she said. Wyatt glanced at his watch. It was 8:45 p.m. Which property was the Victorian on Maple? She was already heading for the door. Her movements were hurried. "Didn't that go under contract yesterday?" Landon asked, looking up from where he was painting Jupiter. Mom was telling Aunt Sarah about it at dinner. Amber froze for a fraction of a second. Her hand tightened on her purse strap. "There are so many Victorians in this area." She forced a laugh. "Make sure you finish that, Lon." Before bed, she closed the door behind her with a soft click. Wyatt helped Landon attach the planets to his wife. High orbits, his movements were mechanical as his mind cataloged another lie to add to his growing collection. "Dad," Landon's voice pulled him back to the present. "Is everything okay? Mom seems different lately." Wyatt met his son's concern with, "Gaze, everything's fine." He hated the necessity of it. "Focus on your project." Saturn's ring. Later that night, Wyatt heard Amber's phone ring in the kitchen. He could hear her voice carrying through the air. "I miss you too," she whispered. "No, I can't. I'm sorry I can't tonight. I know. I promise. The open house this weekend." "Yes, that would be perfect. He never comes to those." Wyatt's fingers hovered over his keyboard. His screen filled with, he'd been looking over the financial records, but now he opened a new tab and logged into their joint account. The transaction history told its own story. Hotel charges that looked like client meetings, expensive dinners listed as business expenses, and gifts that never appeared in their home. He pulled up the credit card statements and cross-referenced dates and locations. A pattern emerged: charges at the Lakeside Hotel every other Thursday, always between 2 and 5 p.m., 15 dinner receipts from fancy restaurants far from any of her usual spots. A charge from an upscale jewelry store, definitely not his style. He was adding up the total when Amber appeared in his doorway wearing silk pajamas he'd never seen before. "Still working?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He replied, switching back to his work spreadsheet. With a quick keystroke, she asked, "How was your call?" "Just a client with potential," she replied, lingering in the doorway before entering the office. Her perfume, the same brand she'd worn for years, now seemed false. She perched on the edge of his desk, an old habit that used to charm him. Now he noticed how she angled herself, using the poses that worked so well in her real estate. "Headshots, Wyatt," she began, her voice taking on that soft, persuasive tone she used with all clients. "I've been thinking about us." He turned to face her, his expression neutral. "Oh." She reached out to touch his hand, but he subtly shifted, pretending to reach for his mouse. If she noticed, she didn't show it. "We've been together a long time," she began, "and I love her life. But sometimes I wonder if we've become too routine, too predictable." Wyatt leaned back in his chair, waiting for the next fraud investigation. This was often the moment when people revealed themselves, thinking they were clever, thinking they had the upper hand. "I've been reading about different kinds of relationships, modern marriages, open marriages." She watched his face carefully. "What do you think about trying something like that?" The fact that he had to ask permission after the fact made him angry, but he kept his voice calm and his expression unchanged. It was like he was reviewing a fraudulent account. "The discrepancy plan was, that what you want, Amber?" She seemed encouraged by his calm response. She leaned forward slightly and said, "I think it could. It would be good for us. It would add some excitement. We could both see other people and explore new connections. It would keep things fresh if that's what you want." I understand the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Amber's face lit up. "Really? You're not upset?" "Why would I be upset about you wanting to be honest?" He turned back to his computer. The screen blew light across his face. "Is there anything else you want to be honest about?" She hesitated for a moment, but his tone had been perfectly neutral. Perhaps it was too neutral, but Amber, like most people who think they're cleverer than they are, heard what she wanted to hear. "No, that's all. Thank you for being so understanding." She stood, smoothing her silk pajamas, and said, "I'm going to bed, don't." After she left, Wyatt opened a new document at the top of the page and typed exit strategy. He began listing assets, accounts, and evidence, making sure to include every detail. He worked through the night, and by morning, he would have the framework for his retaliation. Wyatt Quinn didn't forgive betrayal. He didn't forget, and he never left accounts unsettled. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his work. Landon stood there in his pajamas looking small and uncertain. "Dad, I had a bad dream," he said. Wyatt's expression softened slightly, the only genuine emotion he'd shown all evening. "Come here, buddy," Landon said. He crossed to his father's chair and Wyatt pulled him close. "I want to talk about it." "No," Landon mumbled into his shoulder. "Just check under my bed like you used to." Of course, Wyatt saved his work with a quick keystroke as he followed his son upstairs. He glanced at the closed master bedroom door where Amber slept, unaware that her carefully constructed house of lies was about to collapse. Some people thought numbers were cold and emotionless. Numbers told stories, and they were revealing truths to Wyatt. They were showing him exactly how to dismantle his wife's perfect little world, piece by piece. He checked under Landon's bed and performed the ritual of monster banishing that had comforted his son since he was small. He tucked Landon back in and made a silent promise. Whatever happened next, he would protect his children. Wyatt knew he had to protect his children from becoming collateral damage in their mother's betrayal. Back in his office, he resumed his work. The spread showed that each new entry was another nail in the coffin of his marriage. Unlike Amber's careless affair, his response would be calculated, precise, and absolutely devastating. Amber thought she was being clever with her secret phone calls and hidden hotel charges, but she was wrong. She'd forgotten one crucial detail. She'd married a man who made his living by exposing lies and making people pay for their deceptions. And he was very, very good at his job. The manila envelope sat unopened on Wyatt's desk, his name printed in stark black letters across the front. Inside lay answers he both needed and dreaded. After weeks of waiting, the DNA test results had finally arrived. He picked up the envelope and opened it. He picked up the letter opener, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. One clean slice and there would be no going back. The office felt too quiet, the morning sun streaming through the windows and casting a bright light on his computer screen. Financial records blinked on his screen, showing the latest transactions from their joint accounts. Another suspicious withdrawal. Just another audit, he muttered to himself. Though this was far more personal than any corporate investigation, he opened the envelope with surgical precision. The first page was standard documentation, lab information, testing procedures. He skimmed past it to the results, his eyes fixed on the percentages and the clinical language that would forever change his life. Parent-child DNA test results. Subject A, Quinn. Subject B, Landon Quinn. Probability of paternity, 99%. 99% parent-child DNA test results. Subject A, Quinn. Subject B, Sky Quinn. Probability of paternity, 0%. The paper didn't shake in his hands, his breathing didn't change. But something inside him hardened even further, like steel being tempered in fire. His office phone rang at 10. "Send them in," he replied, his voice steady as he slipped the results into his desk drawer. The door opened and his private investigator, Mike Thompson, walked in. Mike looked exactly like what he was, a man who uncovered uncomfortable truths for a living. "What do you have for me?" Mike asked, nodding. He sat down across from him and pulled out a thick folder. "You were right about everything. The affair's been going on for at least 8 months. Dean Grady has a history of this kind of thing. He's had 3 previous relationships with married women, all real estate agents he worked with. Show me everything." Mike spread photos across the desk. Amber and Dean at restaurants, hotels, stolen moments at empty properties. Each image was time-stamped and documented with military precision. "Here's them at Marino last Tuesday." Mike pointed to a photo. "They had a 2-hour lunch at the Lakeside Hotel on Thursday. They're not even trying to hide it anymore." Wyatt picked up another photo of Amber getting into Dean's car outside of property that wasn't even listed for sale. "Tell me about their patterns." "They meet 3 or 4 times a week, usually during what she claims are showings or client meetings. Dean's been scheduling renovation workarounds around her supposed appointments. They think they're clever about it. And then there's the financial angle." Mike pulled out a stack of invoices, which is where it gets interesting. Every innovation project they've worked on together doesn't add up. Dean's been padding the bills, charging for work that wasn't done, premium materials that weren't delivered, and extra labor hours that didn't exist. And Amber's been approving everything without question. She's the one handling all the paperwork over the last 6 months, and they've skimmed nearly $50,000. $0,000 from various projects. Why's jaw tightened. Show me the trail here. Mike laid out the bank statements. Dean deposits the padded amounts into his business account a few days later. Some of them show up in a private account under his brother's name. Then smaller withdrawals, always in cash. Money laundering 101. Wyatt muttered, "Sloppy, your wife's been moving money too. Small amounts at first, but getting bolder. Last month alone, she transferred $30,000. I noticed that 0000 had been transferred from your joint accounts to a private one. I traced this back to her sister's address. I also pulled up his own financial records and noticed the transfers. I've been documenting everything." Mike hesitated about Sky. "I know why. I cut him off and tapped the drawer with the DNA results." I have confirmation that Mike's expression softened slightly. "Jesus, Wyatt, I'm sorry. You wanted to look into it." "No, that's not relevant right now. Tell me about their conversations." Mike produced a transcript recorded at the Lakeside Hotel last Thursday. "You're going to." Wyatt scanned the pages, his expression growing colder with each line. "Once the divorce starts, we can push for everything. His money, the house, Amber. He won't suspect anything. He's too buried in his work to notice. They could build a real estate empire, but they need capital. My capital. She was going to suggest an open marriage, and then use that as grounds for divorce when you refused. That'll paint you as controlling and unreasonable. She already made the suggestion last week." Mike's eyebrows shot up. "What did you say?" "I told her I understood. Let her think she had the upper hand." Wyatt stood and walked to the window. The city spread out below. He was unaware and uncaring about the drama unfolding in his office. "She forgot what I do for a living. She forgot that I spend my days uncovering people's lies, following their money trails, and documenting their betrayals. What's your plan?" Wyatt turned back to his desk, pulling up files on his computer. "First, we protect the assets. I've already started moving things into a trust for Landon. Amber's been too busy with her affair to notice. And Sky." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I've been her father for 8 years. That doesn't change overnight." But legally he tapped a few keys, bringing out more documents, UNC contesting custody. The DNA results and evidence of Amber's infidelity and financial misconduct should be enough. She won't go down without a fight. "Good." Wyatt's voice was cold. "I'm counting on it." The next few hours were spent in meticulous planning. By the time Mike left, Wyatt had a comprehensive strategy mapped out. Every contingency was covered. Every angle was considered. That evening, he attended a neighborhood barbecue, part of his carefully orchestrated public campaign. Amber was working late as usual. The Parkers' backyard was filled with familiar faces, all the pieces he needed to put together his strategy. Wyatt, Sarah, their next-door neighbor, waved him over. Her husband Tom was standing there, looking after the grill. "Where's Amber?" "Another one." He kept his tone neutral but let a hint of concern show through. "She's been working unusual hours lately." Sarah's expression shifted subtly. "Yes, I've noticed. Always with that contractor, Dean. Have you noticed anything specific?" Wyatt asked carefully. Sarah glanced around before lowering her voice. "Well, I didn't want to say. Nothing. I saw them last week at Marino's. It didn't look like a business launch." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, turning from the grill. They were close, holding hands across the table. "I thought maybe I was seeing things, but I see why." I took a sip of my drink. "That's concerning." "Come to think of it," Tom added, "I've seen his truck parked near the Anderson house. You know, the one that sold months ago. In the middle of the day, no construction going on. Probably just checking the property." "Why did he do that?" I asked mildly, knowing the seed was planted. Sarah said quickly, "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation," but her eyes said different. Wyatt knew the conversation would spread through the company like wildfire, exactly as he'd planned. By the time he left the neighborhood, gossip was in full swing. He found Landon and Sky. Landon was watching TV, but his eyes were distant. He seemed troubled. "Can I talk to you, buddy?" he asked Wyatt. Wyatt sat down. Landon glanced at Sky, then lowered his voice. "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" he asked. The question hit hard, but Wyatt kept his voice gentle. "What makes you ask that?" he replied. "I heard Mom on the phone. She was talking about lawyers and she was crying. Plus, Tommy at school said his parents were talking about Mom and some guy named Dean." Wyatt pulled his son close, feeling the slight tremor in the boy's shoulders. "Sometimes, buddy, Adults make choices that hurt the people they love. But I want you to know something. No. No matter what happens, you'll always be my son. Nothing will ever change that. Wyatt looked at the little girl curled up on the couch. She had blonde hair, just like her mother's. He knew she wasn't his, but 8 years of love didn't disappear with a DNA test. Sky will always be your sister, he said firmly. Family is. It's a bit of a tricky situation, but some things never change. Is Mom going to leave? I'm not sure yet, but whatever happens, I promise you'll be okay. Later that night, Amber came home to find him in his office, looking over documents. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she entered, her perfume mixed with that now familiar scent. Cologne preceding her. The neighbors are talking, she said, her voice tight. Sarah called. She said you were acting strange at the barbecue. Was I? Wyatt didn't look up from his work. She mentioned Dean started asking questions about our listings. What did you tell her? What are you trying to do, Wyatt? Now he met her gaze. That's an interesting question coming from you, she replied, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. What do you mean? You tell me, Amber said. Tell me about the Lakeside Hotel, about the renovation invoices, about Dean. The color drained from her face. You know everything, he said, smiling coldly. I track fraud for a living. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Amber, I follow paper trails to uncover lies. That's my job. You've been spying on me. I've been doing my job the same way I did when Morrison Foods tried to hide their embezzlement, and the same way I did when Carlton Industries cooked their books. I follow the money. Yours and Amber's. It tells quite a story. It's not what you think. He pulled out the DNA results, then explained this. She snatched the paper, her hands shaking as she read. You had no right. I had every right, just like I had the right to track where our money was going and investigate the inflated invoices you approve for your lover to. Document every lie, every betrayal, every theft. I haven't got the money you've been funneling to Dean through fake renovation charges. That's theft. The joint accounts you've been draining. That's theft. The trust you destroyed. That's another kind of theft. She tried to rally to regain control. I'll fight you. I'll take it all. Everything. You won't cut her off because I have it all documented, every meeting, every transfer, every lie. You thought you were so clever planning to take me for everything in a divorce, but you forgot what I do for a living and what's important to me. Landon stays with me, and Sky stays with his dad. We'll let the courts decide. The courts will decide, but given your pattern of deception and financial misconduct, I think I have a good chance. You can't do this. You can't take my children. You took my daughter 8 years ago, and now you're trying to do the same with my son. Amber, I never meant to get caught. I didn't think you'd find out, but you did, and now you'll face the consequences. I'll tell everyone what a cold you're a controlling bastard. The neighbors already know about your affair, your late nights with Dean and your lies. I made sure of it. Your reputation in this community is finished. You planned it. He met her gaze again. You should have remembered. I deal with betrayal for a living. I know exactly how to make people pay for their deceptions. What about what you owe me? 15 years of marriage, 14 years and 3 months of marriage, he corrected, in about 8 months of betrayal. Don't worry. I'll make sure the settlement reflects exactly what you're owed. Nothing more. She fled the office in tears, but Wyatt felt. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a cold determination to see this through to the end. The next morning, he called his lawyer to set the final phase in motion. The storm wasn't just gathering anymore. It was about to break, and Wyatt Quinn would make damn sure he was in control of the lightning. After all, while Amber had played a deception, made it his life's work, and now she'd learn exactly what that meant. Wyatt methodically arranged the documents on the dining room table, each paper placed with surgical precision. The DNA test results were laid out in the center, flanked by divorce papers on either side. He checked his watch, 6:45 p.m. morning. Amber would be home soon from work, late as usual. The garage door opened at 7. Wyatt stayed where he was, still as stone. His hands were folded on the polished mahogany surface, and the keys jingled in his pocket. His heels clicked against the hardwood as he heard Amber's voice carry through the foyer. Honey, why is your car still here? I thought you had that budget meeting tonight. She stopped abruptly in the dining room doorway. Her designer bag slipped off her shoulder as she sat down. Amber. Wyatt's voice was quiet, controlled and professional. She hesitated, her fingertips clutching her bag strap. What's all this? She sat in the chair, scraping against the hardwood as she lowered herself, eyes darting between the papers and his impassive face. Wyatt, what's he then handed her the DNA results. You wanted honesty in our marriage, so let's start there, he said. Amber's face drained of color as she scanned the document, her hands beginning to tremble. This can't be right. There must be some mistake, she said. This is a mistake, Wyatt replied, his voice remaining eerily calm. I had it done. He slid the divorce papers forward, twice to be certain. I can explain, save it. He gave her the divorce papers. Next, I've already spoken with my lawyer. Given the circumstances, I'm filing for full custody of Landon. Amber's perfectly maintained facade cracked. You can't do this. You can't take my children. Landon is mine. As for Sky, he paused, letting the unspoken words fill the space between them. I'll contest custody there as well, please. Amber's voice cracked. We can work this out. I made a mistake. Several mistakes, Wyatt interrupted. Years of them. Would you like to see the itemized list? He pulled out another folder. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, business dinners with Dean that somehow required overnight stays. Amber's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. You wanted an open marriage, Wyatt continued, his tone growing colder. Congratulations, you're about to be. The kids need both parents. She tried to sound desperate. They need a mother who's faithful, who's stable, who's honest. Each word was like an executioner's axe. You gave up everything for Dean. How is he, by the way? He's still remodeling houses and getting married. Tears spilled. Amber's eyes were red from crying and her mascara was running. Don't do this, Wyatt. We can go to counseling. No, he said. This is final. You have 24 hours to sign these papers or everything goes public. Everything, Amber, including Sky paternity. It would hurt her too much. I learned from the best. His smile never reached his eyes. You taught me all about hurting family, didn't you? Amber reached for the papers with shaking hands. What about our accounts? The house? Check your phone. Why? It suggested mildly. I'm sure your banking app will. She reached for her phone, fingers trembling as she pulled up her banking information. Her face drained of color as she saw that everything was empty. These are empty, all of them. How did you remember the one you told Dean was boring and predictable? Wyatt's laugh held no humor. I protected our. My assets, I'll fight this, Amber said, her voice wavering. I'll get a lawyer with what money? Your boyfriend's last, Wyatt said, straightening his tie. I heard Dean's business isn't doing so well. Something about mismanaged funds and angry investors. You can't do anything. I just made a few comments to the right people about some irregularities in his contracting business. It was an anonymous tip, very professional. He picked up his briefcase. I'm staying at the peninsula tonight. The kids are with your sister. You have until tomorrow to sign those papers. Every friend, neighbor, and client in your contact list gets an interesting email about the real estate agent who couldn't keep her properties or her promises straight. He walked to the door and paused. Oh, and Amber, enjoy your freedom. You've earned it. The next morning, Wyatt sat in his office, down-tone, watching his computer screen as notifications rolled in one by one. Joint accounts were closed, credit cards canceled, and property titles transferred. Each electronic chime was another nail in the coffin of Amber's comfortable life. His phone buzzed. Dean's name flashed. Wyatt saw a number on his screen that he'd gotten from Amber's phone records months ago. He let it ring twice before answering. Wyatt Quinn speaking, he said. Listen here, you son of a Mr. Grady Wyatt. When were you planning on calling me? How's the audit going? There was a pause. What did you tell them? Wyatt asked. I told them only what your books already showed. He showed me some invoices that were way too high, as well as some phantom employees and materials that somehow cost triple the market rate. I asked him why he'd examined his fingernails, and he said the numbers don't lie. Dean, you're destroying my business. I'm not the one who took my wife to the Four Seasons room, 1,216 every time. Same room. It was pretty predictable, really. She told me you were clueless, Dean. He spat and said you were too buried in spreadsheets to notice anything, and you believed her. That was your first mistake. Wyatt checked his watch. Your second was assuming I'd do nothing once I knew. I'm rather busy, but I'm sure the IRS agents will have plenty of time to chat when they arrive. Your office this afternoon. Wait. Wyatt ended the call, then opened his email. A new message from Amber. Please don't do this. We could talk about this. The accounts are all empty. I can't even buy groceries. Think about the children." He responded with a single line. "You should have thought about them first. Is that your real estate agent?" Wyatt was there to discuss listing Mrs. Quinn's office property, which she'd sent in. He smiled thinly. Amber's real estate office, her pride and joy, would make an excellent daycare center. He'd already had inquiries. The door opened, and Linda walked in, portfolio in hand. "Mr. Quinn, I have the comps you requested." Wyatt ignored her calls. "Linda, let's talk about how quickly we can get that property on the market. I think it needs to be priced aggressively." When Wyatt arrived with Landon, the annual neighborhood block party was in full swing. Children ran through the sprinklers while adults clustered around grills and coolers. Conversations. They fell silent for a moment as they walked past, then started chatting excitedly again. Sarah Miller, the neighborhood association president, hurried over. "Wyatt, we weren't sure you'd come, but we're so glad you did," she said, giving him a hug, then pulling back with concern in her eyes. "How are you holding up?" "Just taking it day by day," he replied loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. "Landon and I are adjusting. It's a shame about Amber." Sarah clucked, and with that contractor. "Well, we all suspected something wasn't right when they kept having those late-night project meetings." Wyatt gave a modest shrug. "Sometimes people aren't what they seem." "Dad," Landon tugged at his sleeve. "Can I go play with Max?" "Of course, buddy." Wyatt watched his son run. He noticed that the other parents made space for him, offered him snacks, and included him with extra warmth. It was clear that the community had chosen its side. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Amber had arrived. She wore her favorite red dress, the one she'd worn to countless open houses, but it hung differently now, as if she'd lost weight, and her makeup was heavier than usual. To cover up her dark circles, Sarah whispered, "I can't believe she showed up." Amber approached a group of women she'd once called her closest friends. They turned away one by one until she stood alone. She scanned the crowd, finally spotting Landon playing with the other children. She called out, "Landon, honey, come give Mom a hug." The boy looked up at Wyatt, looking a bit unsure. "It's okay," Wyatt said quietly. "Go ahead." Landon ran to his mother, but the hug was brief and a bit awkward. He pulled away quickly. "Dad and I made cookies for the party," he told her. "I helped frost." "That's great, sweetheart." Amber's voice cracked a bit. "Maybe we could bake something together soon at home. My new apartment is above the laundromat." One of the neighbors asked loudly, "Must be quite a change from the house." Amber's cheeks flushed. She looked around, finding only cold stares and turned backs. Even those who didn't know the full story had heard enough whispers and seen enough evidence of her fall from grace. "I should go," she murmured. Her voice was full of false concern. "But you just got here. I suppose you might have another meeting to attend." Amber's eyes filled with tears as she turned and fled, her heels clicking rapidly on the sidewalk as neighbors watched her retreat. Wyatt accepted a beer from Tom Parker, one of the dads, rough stuff man. Tom said, "But you're handling it like a champ. Kids are lucky to have you just doing what needs to be done." Wyatt replied, taking a long sip later that evening after Landon was asleep in his race car bed. Wyatt sat in his home office. The house felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if Amber's departure had cleared away a lingering toxin. He opened his laptop and checked his accounts one last time. Everything was secure. He was sure his son's future was secure. The trusts were rock solid, and even Sky, though not his, would have a college fund. He wasn't heartless, just careful. A notification popped up. The divorce was final. Amber had signed everything, likely realizing she had no choice. No alimony, limited visitation, all assets protected. His lawyer had called it the most airtight divorce agreement he'd ever seen. He'd never seen a divorce agreement so watertight. Wyatt closed his laptop and walked to the window. The street was quiet and peaceful, and in a few houses lights were still on. Happy families, normal lives. He'd rebuild that someday, but not yet. He had his son, his dignity, and the satisfaction of knowing that betrayal carried consequences. He didn't smile often. These days, he didn't smile much. But now, thinking of Amber in her tiny apartment, Dean facing federal investigators, and how he'd dismantled their comfortable world of lies, he smiled. They thought he was blind, absorbed in numbers and spreadsheets. They never understood that numbers were just another way of keeping score, and Wyatt Quinn had always been very good at math.